The airport hummed with the restless energy of 1,000 lives colliding, suitcases clattering, voices overlapping, and the faint roar of jet engines echoing beyond the glass walls. Amid the chaos, a small figure emerged from the crowd, stepping toward the boarding gate with a quiet purpose that seemed out of place. Ethan, just 13 years old, was a wiry boy with skin the color of rich mahogany and eyes that sparkled with a sharpness beyond his years. His faded jeans hung loose on his frame, and a weathered black backpack clung to one shoulder, its straps fraying at the edges. In his hand he clutched a boarding pass, the crisp paper marked for business class, a ticket that felt like a golden key in his small, steady grip. He approached the gate, his sneakers scuffing softly against the polished floor, and the air shifted as eyes turned toward him. Not the warm, curious glances of fellow travelers, but something sharper, more judgmental. Standing there, gatekeeper to the plane, was Linda, flight attendant with a smile as polished as her uniform but eyes that gleamed with a brittle edge. Her blonde hair was pulled tight into a bun, her scarlet scarf knotted with precision, and her posture screamed authority. She was the kind of woman who thrived on control, who could spot a wrinkle in a plane or a person from a mile away. And when her gaze landed on Ethan, that smile flickered, replaced by a smirk that curled like smoke. "Well, well," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the terminal, loud enough to turn heads. "Looks like someone's lost. Did you wander away from the kiddie play area, little man?" A ripple of laughter spread through the nearby passengers, sharp and stinging, and Ethan's cheeks flushed a deep crimson. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, holding out his boarding pass with a hand that didn't tremble. "This is my ticket, ma'am," he said softly, his voice steady despite the heat creeping up his neck. "Business class, seat 4B. Linda's eyebrows shot up, her lips parting in mock surprise as she snatched the ticket from his grasp. She held it up to the light, tilting it this way and that as if it might reveal some hidden trick. The passengers behind Ethan shifted, some craning their necks to watch, others whispering behind their hands. Linda's eyes flicked from the ticket to the boy, then back again, her smirk hardening into something colder. "Business class, huh?" she muttered, loud enough for the nearest ears to catch. "Sure you didn't swipe this from someone, kid?" Ethan blinked, his breath catching for a split second, but he stood his ground. "No, ma'am. It's mine." His words were polite, almost too polite, as if he'd been taught to wield courtesy like a shield. Linda hesitated, her fingers tightening on the pass before she tossed it back to him with a flick of her wrist, the paper fluttering like a fallen leaf. It landed against his chest, and he caught it just before it hit the floor. "Fine," she said, stepping aside with a dramatic sweep of her arm. "Go on then. But don't go bothering anyone important back there. Got it, kiddo?" Her tone dripped with condescension, each syllable a barb aimed straight at him. Ethan nodded once, a quick, tight motion, and slipped past her, his backpack brushing against the gate's edge. As he walked down the jetway, the weight of her words clung to him like damp air, heavy and suffocating. Linda turned back to the next passenger, a businessman in a crisp suit, her smile snapping back into place like a mask clicking shut. "Welcome aboard, sir," she chirped, her voice all honey now, as if the last 30 seconds hadn't happened. But behind her, the murmurs had already begun. A gray-haired woman near the gate clutched her purse tighter, her lips pursing as she watched Ethan disappear into the tunnel. A young couple exchanged a glance, one whispering, "Did she really just say that?" The seeds of unease were planted, tiny cracks in the polished surface of the flight's routine. Ethan stepped onto the plane, the cool recycled air hitting his face as he navigated the narrow aisle toward business class. His heart thudded a little faster than usual, but his expression stayed calm, a mask he'd worn too many times before. He slid into seat 4B, the plush leather creaking under his slight weight, and tucked his backpack beneath the seat in front of him. Out the window, the tarmac shimmered in the afternoon heat, a world he was leaving behind for now. He didn't know it yet, but the real turbulence wasn't outside the plane. It was already brewing in the cabin, sparked by a single judgment that would soon spiral into something none of them could predict. And Linda? She stood at the door, clipboard in hand, greeting the stream of passengers with that same practiced smile. She thought she'd sized up the boy in an instant, too young, too out of place, too insignificant. But as the last traveler boarded and the jetway pulled back, She had no idea that her snap decision was about to unravel in ways that would shake her world to its core. The cabin lights flickered to life as the plane taxied toward the runway, casting a sterile glow over the rows of passengers settling into their seats. Ethan sat quietly in 4B, his small frame swallowed by the oversized business-class chair. His fingers traced the frayed edge of his backpack, now stowed neatly beneath the seat ahead, as he stared out the window. The jet engines rumbled to life, a low growl that vibrated through the floor, but it couldn't drown out the sting of Linda's words still echoing in his ears. Don't go bothering anyone important. He pressed his lips into a thin line, willing himself to let it go, but the heat of embarrassment lingered like a bruise. Up front, Linda moved with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd worked this dance 1,000 times. Her heels clicked against the aisle, her scarlet scarf fluttering as she handed out warm towels to the first few rows of business class. "Here you are, sir," she purred to a gray-suited man, her smile bright as polished glass. "And for you, ma'am," she added to a woman in a silk blouse, her tone dripping with deference. The passengers nodded back, pleased, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few seats away. But when Linda's eyes flicked toward Ethan, that smile vanished, replaced by a shadow of irritation that tightened her jaw. She reached his row, her tray of steaming towels hovering just out of his reach. Ethan looked up, expectant, his dark eyes catching hers for a fleeting moment. But Linda didn't offer him one. Instead, she straightened, her voice slicing through the hum of the cabin. "Oh, no water for you yet, kid," she said, loud enough to draw glances from nearby seats. "If you're thirsty, the galley's in the back. Go fetch it yourself, I'm not your babysitter." A few passengers chuckled nervously, the sound sharp and jagged, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the edge in her tone. Ethan blinked, his breath hitching as the words landed like a slap. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, his hands curling into loose fists on his lap. "Okay," he murmured, so soft it was nearly lost in the engine's drone. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his slight frame weaving through the aisle toward the galley. The plane jolted slightly as it turned onto the runway, and he steadied himself against a seatback, his sneakers silent against the carpet. Linda watched him go, her lips curling into a smug little twist. She turned back to her duties, handing a drink to a man in a pinstripe suit with a flourish. "Enjoy, sir," she said, her cheers snapping back into place like a switch flipped. But as Ethan reached the galley, fumbling with a plastic cup under the tiny sink, Linda's voice rang out again. "Hurry it up back there, kid. We're not holding takeoff for you." The words carried a bite, and this time the cabin's murmurs grew louder, a ripple of unease spreading like spilled ink. Ethan filled his cup, the water trembling slightly in his grip, and started back toward his seat. He kept his head down, avoiding the curious stares boring into him from every angle. But Linda wasn't done. As he passed her in the aisle, she stepped forward too quickly, too deliberately, and her shoulder slammed into his. The cup slipped from his hand, water splashing across his faded jeans and pooling on the floor in a glistening mess. Ethan stumbled, catching himself against a seat, his breath sharp and ragged. "Oops," Linda said, her voice dripping with mock surprise. She didn't bend to help, didn't offer a napkin, just stood there, arms crossed, her eyes glinting with something cruel. "Guess you'll need to watch where you're going next time, huh, kid?" The cabin fell silent for a heartbeat, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then a voice broke through, an older woman with silver hair and a face creased with indignation, seated just across the aisle from Ethan. "That's enough," she snapped, her words cutting like a whip. "He's just a boy, for heaven's sake. What's wrong with you?" Her eyes blazed, daring Linda to respond. A few heads nodded in agreement, a man in a tweed jacket muttering, "She's out of line," to his seatmate. But Linda didn't flinch. She shrugged, a lazy roll of her shoulders, and shot back, "He's fine. Just a kid who doesn't know his place, that's all." She turned on her heel, her heels clicking as she strode toward the front, leaving Ethan standing there, wet and humiliated, the cold water seeping into his socks. He slid back into his seat, his jaw tight, and pulled his backpack onto his lap like a shield. The older woman leaned across the aisle, her voice softening. "Don't you mind her, sweetheart," she whispered, her hand hovering as if she wanted to pat his shoulder but thought better of it. Some people don't know kindness if it bit them. Ethan managed a small, grateful nod, his fingers digging into the straps of his bag. Thank you, he said, barely audible, his eyes dropping to the floor. The plane lurched forward, engines roaring as it hurtled down the runway and lifted into the sky. The cabin tilted, the world outside blurring into streaks of gray and blue. But inside, the air felt heavier than ever. Linda busied herself at the galley, her movements sharp and clipped, as if she could outpace the growing whispers behind her. She didn't see the way the older woman's gaze lingered on her, hard and unforgiving. She didn't hear the man in tweed pull out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen as if debating whether to start recording. And she didn't notice Ethan sitting silently in 4B, his damp jeans clinging to his legs, his calm facade hiding a storm of his own. She thought she'd won this round, put the boy in his place with a few sharp words and a well-timed shove. But the plane was climbing now, slicing through the clouds, and with every inch it rose, the cracks in her control were widening. The passengers were watching. The tension was building. And somewhere in the hum of the engines, a reckoning was waiting, quiet, patient, and unstoppable. The plane sliced through the sky at 30,000 feet, the hum of its engines a steady heartbeat beneath the chatter of passengers and the clink of drink trays. In business class, Ethan sat hunched in seat 4B, his damp jeans still clinging to his legs from Linda's earlier accident. He'd pulled a worn notebook from his backpack, scribbling absent-mindedly to keep his mind off the cold seeping into his skin and the sting of her words. Just a kid who doesn't know his place. Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman watched him with quiet sympathy, her knitting needles clicking softly, while the man in tweed a few rows back tapped his phone, his brow furrowed as if weighing some unspoken decision. Up front, Linda moved through the cabin like a queen holding court, her scarlet scarf fluttering as she handed out drinks with a practiced smile. "Champagne, sir?" she cooed to the gray-suited man, who nodded appreciatively. "Water with lemon, ma'am?" she asked the silk-bloused woman, her tone smooth as velvet. But when her gaze swept past Ethan, that warmth vanished, replaced by a flicker of disdain that tightened her lips. She turned away, her heels clicking toward the galley, oblivious to the eyes tracking her every move, the older woman's narrowing, the tweed man's hardening. Then it happened. A jolt rocked the plane, sharp and sudden, like a fist slamming against its hull. Glasses rattled on trays and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but edged with urgency. "Folks, we've hit some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The plane shuddered again, harder this time, tilting as if caught in a giant's grip. Overhead bins creaked, a suitcase thumped against its latch, and a woman in the back let out a stifled scream. Panic clawed at the air, electric and wild. Linda sprang into action, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone sit down. Now!" she barked, gripping the edge of a seat as the plane lurched. Passengers scrambled, belts clicking into place, their faces pale and wide-eyed. But then her eyes locked on Ethan, still seated, his notebook clutched tight against his chest. Something twisted in her expression, anger, spite, a need to assert control, and she jabbed a finger at him, her voice rising above the din. "You kid, get up and help me move these trays to the galley now." Ethan froze, his breath catching as the plane rocked again. "But," he started, his voice small against the roar of the storm. Linda didn't wait. "Don't argue with me," she snapped, stomping toward him, her face flushed with authority. "Move it, or I'll drag you myself." The older woman across the aisle leaned forward, her knitting tumbling to the floor. "Are you mad?" she shouted. "He's just a boy, leave him be." But Linda ignored her, her hand shooting out to grab Ethan's arm, yanking him to his feet. The plane pitched violently to the right, a sickening lurch that sent trays crashing and passengers gripping their armrests. Ethan stumbled into the aisle, Linda shoving a stack of metal trays into his arms. "Go. Back there now," she ordered, pointing to the galley as if it were a battlefield command. The trays wobbled in his grip, heavy and slick, and he took a shaky step forward, his sneakers slipping on the wet spot from earlier. The cabin lights flickered, plunging them into a strobe of shadow and glare, and the wind outside howled like a living thing. He made it 3 steps before the plane dropped at a stomach-churning plunge that tore a scream from half the cabin. Ethan's foot caught the edge of a seat, and the trays flew from his hands, clattering like cymbals as he fell hard. His small body slammed into the aisle, his head cracking against the armrest of a chair with a sickening thud. Blood bloomed on his forehead, a bright red streak against his dark skin, and he crumpled dazed, his notebook skidding across the floor. The cabin erupted. "What the hell is wrong with you?" roared the tweed man, unbuckling his seatbelt to stand despite the turbulence. The older woman leapt up too, her voice shrill with fury. "You monster! Look what you've done!" Passengers twisted in their seats, some shouting, others gaping in horror as Ethan lay there, clutching his head, blood dripping between his fingers. Linda staggered back, her face draining of color, her hands trembling as she stared at the boy she'd forced into harm's way. "Tu didn't mean," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I didn't think he'd fall like that." The plane steadied for a moment, the storm's fury easing just enough to let the chaos inside take center stage. The tweed man pulled out his phone, the camera light flashing as he started recording, his jaw tight with outrage. "This is going viral," he muttered, loud enough for Linda to hear. The older woman knelt beside Ethan, her hands hovering over him, frantic but gentle. "Stay still, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You're going to be okay." Ethan blinked up at her, pain clouding his eyes, but he nodded weakly, his breath shallow. Linda stood frozen, her clipboard slipping from her grasp to clatter on the floor. The weight of a dozen accusing stares bore down on her, and the hum of the engine seemed to mock her, a steady pulse against the wreckage of her control. She'd wanted to prove a point, to put the boy in his place, but now the trays lay scattered, the aisles stained with water and blood, and the cabin buzzed with a fury she couldn't silence. She opened her mouth to explain, to deflect, but the words died in her throat. Outside, the storm growled on, a beast circling its prey. Inside, the real tempest was just beginning, and Linda had no idea how close she was to its eye. Ethan's bloodied hand pressed against his forehead, his small frame trembling but unbroken, and somewhere beyond the galley's curtain, a shadow stirred tall, commanding, and about to step into the light. The plane groaned as it leveled out, the storm's fury fading into a distant rumble beyond the clouds. Inside, the cabin buzzed with a different kind of tempest, anger, shock, and the sharp tang of blood in the air. Ethan lay sprawled in the aisle, his small hand pressed against his forehead where a crimson streak matted his skin. The trays Linda had forced him to carry lay scattered like wreckage, glinting under the flickering cabin lights. The older woman knelt beside him, her silver hair wild from the turbulence, her voice a trembling thread of comfort. "Hold on, sweetheart, just hold on," she murmured, her hands hovering uselessly over his wound. Around them, the passengers were a chorus of outrage. The man in tweed stood in the aisle, his phone still recording, the red dot of the camera a silent accusation. "This is unbelievable," he shouted, his voice raw. "She made a kid do this mess." Others joined in, their words tumbling over each other like falling dominoes. "She's lost it. Someone get the captain. Look at him's hurt." The air crackled with fury, every eye darting between Ethan's crumpled form and Linda, who stood frozen a few feet away, her face ashen, her clipboard abandoned on the floor. Linda's hand shook as she stared at the boy she'd pushed into danger. Her lips parted, a weak protest spilling out. "Tu didn't mean for this," she stammered, her voice cracking like thin ice. "It was an accident, slipped." But the words sounded hollow, drowned by the rising tide of the passengers' anger. The older woman snapped her head up, her eyes blazing. "An accident," she spat. "You dragged him out of his seat in a storm. You're lucky he's not." She stopped, choking on the thought, and turned back to Ethan, brushing his hair gently from his bloodied forehead. Then the curtain to first class rustled, and a hush fell over the cabin, sudden and heavy, as if the air itself held its breath. A tall figure stepped through, a man whose presence seemed to fill the space, his broad shoulders cutting a sharp silhouette against the dim light. He wore a tailored black suit, impeccable despite the flight's chaos, and his face carried a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs mid-breath. His skin was a deep brown, his jaw set like carved stone, and his eyes sharp, piercing, swept over the scene with a precision that missed nothing. James Carter, a name whispered in boardrooms and headlines, a billionaire whose tech empire and philanthropy had reshaped the world, stood there, unassuming yet undeniable. He moved swiftly, his polished shoes silent against the carpet, and dropped to one knee beside Ethan. The boy's eyes fluttered open, pain clouding them, but they softened at the sight of the man. "Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice frail but steady. James's hand found his son's shoulder, firm and protective, as he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it gently to the wound. "I'm here, son," he said, his tone low and warm, a lifeline in the storm. "You okay?" Ethan nodded weakly, wincing as the cloth staunched the blood. "Yeah, Dad. Just hurts a little." The word "Dad" hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the seats, heads swiveling as recognition dawned. "That's James Carter," hissed the silk-bloused woman, her glass of water forgotten. "The James Carter?" echoed the gray-suited man, his champagne sloshing as he leaned forward. The tweed man's phone tilted, zooming in, his voice a hushed mutter. "Holy his kid? This is gold." Whispers exploded into a frenzy, a mix of awe and disbelief swirling around the man now cradling his injured son. James straightened, his full height towering as he turned to face Linda. His gaze locked onto her, and it was like the weight of a mountain crashing down. Her breath caught, her knees buckling slightly under the intensity of those eyes, calm. Yes, but burning with something unspoken, something dangerous. "What did you do to my son?" he asked, his voice quiet but cutting, each word a blade honed to precision. The question hung there, heavy and unanswerable, stripping away every excuse Linda had clung to. She stumbled back a step, her hands fluttering uselessly at her sides. "Two didn't know," she choked out, her voice rising in pitch. "I didn't know he was your son, sir. It was a mistake, I swear." Her words tumbled over each other, desperate and pleading, but they fell flat against the steel of James's expression. He didn't shout, didn't raise his voice, but the silence that followed was louder than any yell. He glanced down at Ethan, then back at her, and the faintest tightening of his jaw betrayed the storm beneath his calm. The older woman stood now, her hands on her hips, her voice ringing out. "Didn't know? You didn't need to know who he was to treat him like a human being." The tweed man nodded, his camera still rolling. "She's right. This isn't about who he is, it's about what you did." The passengers murmured agreement, their outrage now fueled by the revelation of Ethan's identity. Phones were out everywhere, lights flashing, the moment captured from every angle as it spiraled beyond Linda's grasp. James bent down again, helping Ethan to his feet with a gentleness that belied his imposing frame. "Lean on me, champ," he said softly, guiding his son back to seat 4B. Ethan sank into the chair, the handkerchief pressed to his head, his small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. James stood guard beside him, a sentinel in black, his eyes never leaving Linda. "You put a 13-year-old boy in harm's way," he said, his voice steady but laced with ice. "Because of what? Your pride? Your assumptions? I'll make sure this doesn't end here." Linda's face crumpled, tears welling as the reality crashed over her. The cabin pulsed with energy, anger, awe, anticipation as passengers leaned forward, some clapping, others typing furiously on their screens. The tweed man grinned, muttering, "This is live now, done." The older woman crossed her arms, a satisfied glint in her eye, while Ethan, bloodied but unbroken, looked up at his father with a trust that needed no words. Linda stood alone, the center of a storm she'd ignited, her scarlet scarf drooping like a wilted flag. She'd misjudged the boy, underestimated the consequences, and now the truth towered over her in the form of James Carter, a man whose quiet fury promised a reckoning she couldn't escape. The plane flew on, steady now, but the real turbulence was just beginning. The cabin lights steadied as the plane cruised through the now calm skies, but the air inside remained thick with tension, a storm of whispers and flashing phone screens. Ethan sat in seat 4B, his small frame slumped against the leather, the blood-streaked handkerchief still pressed to his forehead. His breaths came slow and shallow, pain etching faint lines around his eyes, but his gaze stayed steady, fixed on the man standing beside him. James Carter loomed like a pillar of quiet strength, his tailored suit unruffled, his hands resting lightly on the seatback as he surveyed the chaos his presence had unleashed. The passengers buzzed around them, some filming, others murmuring in awe, while the weight of his last words to Linda, "I'll make sure this doesn't end here," hung like a guillotine blade. Linda stood a few rows back, her scarlet scarf askew, her once crisp uniform now a crumpled shell of her former confidence. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of a tray, her eyes darting between James's towering figure and the sea of accusing stares. The Tweed man's phone was still rolling, his voice a low hum over 1 million views already, while the older woman across the aisle glared at her with a mix of triumph and disgust. Linda's chest tightened, each breath a struggle as the reality sank in. She'd hurt a child, humiliated herself, and now faced the wrath of a man whose name alone could unravel her career. Her mind raced, scrambling for a lifeline. Rice fields of excuses. It was an accident. I didn't know, but they felt flimsy, hollow against the blood on the floor and the boy's quiet pain. James turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto her again, and Linda felt her knees buckle under the weight of that gaze. It wasn't anger she saw there, not the explosive kind she'd expected, but something colder, deeper, a disappointment that cut sharper than any shout. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. The cabin fell silent, phones tilting to capture every second, as he stopped just short of her, his shadow falling across her like a sentence. "You put my son in danger," he said, his voice low and measured, each word a stone dropped into still water. "A 13-year-old boy, dragged into a storm because you couldn't see past your own pride. Tell Muey." The question wasn't loud, but it reverberated, demanding an answer she didn't have. Linda's mouth opened, then closed, her throat dry as sand. "Tu didn't mean," she started, but James raised a hand, cutting her off, the gesture so calm it was terrifying. "Intentions don't erase consequences," he said, his tone unyielding. "You judged him the moment he stepped on this plane. And now look at him." He nodded toward Ethan, whose small hand tightened on the handkerchief, blood seeping through the fabric. The older woman huffed, muttering, "She's got no excuse," loud enough for all to hear, and a ripple of agreement swept through the seats. Linda's eyes welled with tears, her facade cracking as the weight of her actions pressed down. She dropped the tray, the clatter echoing in the hush, and took a shaky step forward, her voice breaking. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry," she choked out, tears spilling now, hot and fast. "I didn't know who he was, I didn't think, I swear I'd never have done it if I'd known." The words tumbled out, raw and pleading, but they landed like ash, brittle and lifeless. James's expression didn't soften, but his gaze shifted to Ethan, a silent question passing between them. Ethan sat up straighter, wincing as he adjusted the cloth, his young face pale but composed beyond his years. He looked at Linda, his eyes searching hers not with hate, but with something heavier, something she couldn't name. "I don't want you to lose your job over this," he said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The cabin gasped, a collective intake of breath as he continued. "But I hope you don't treat anyone else like that. Not ever again." The words hit Linda harder than any reprimand could have. She staggered back, her hand clutching her chest, as if his grace had punched the air from her lungs. James nodded once, a faint flicker of pride crossing his face as he rested a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "That's my son," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "Wiser than most adults I know." Then he turned back to Linda, his voice dropping lower, steel-edged. "But don't mistake his kindness for weakness or mine. This will follow you. Not out of spite, but because it has to. People need to see this. Learn from it." The Tweed man grinned, his phone still up. "Oh, they're seeing it all right, 2 million views now." The silk-bloused woman whispered to her neighbor, "She's finished." And the gray-suited man nodded, his champagne forgotten. Linda sank against the galley wall, her sobs quiet but wrenching, as the passengers' phones lit up the cabin like fireflies, each screen a mirror reflecting her shame. Ethan leaned his head back, closing his eyes, the pain still etched in his features but his breathing steadier now. James stood watch, a silent guardian, his presence a wall between his son and the world. The older woman reached across the aisle, her hand brushing Ethan's arm gently. "You're a good boy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your dad's right to be proud." Linda wiped her face, her hands shaking as she tried to gather herself. Ethan's forgiveness hadn't absolved her, it had exposed her, laid her bare in a way anger never could. James's promise that this wouldn't end here echoed in her ears, and she knew the videos, the whispers, the fallout were already spiraling beyond her reach. She'd wanted control, but now she had none. And as the plane flew on, the cabin alive with the hum of judgment, she felt the first real stab of something new. Not just fear, but the faint, fragile hope that she could change if she could face what she'd done. The plane's engines whined as it descended, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign cutting through the cabin's restless hum. Outside, the world sharpened into view, runways glinting under the late-day sun, a patchwork of terminals stretching toward the horizon. Inside, the air still crackled with the aftermath of the storm, both literal and human-made. Ethan sat in 4B, his head resting against the window, the bloodied handkerchief now a crumpled wad in his lap. The gash on his forehead had clotted into a dark line, and though his face was pale, his eyes held a quiet resilience that seemed to steady the space around him. James stood beside him, his tall frame a silent anchor, his hand resting lightly on his son's shoulder as the plane taxied to the gate. The passengers stirred, unbuckling belts and reaching for bags, but their attention lingered on the drama that had unfolded. Phones still glowed, screens flashing with notifications, comments, shares, outrage spreading like wildfire across the digital ether. The tweed man pocketed his device, a grim smile tugging at his lips as he muttered, 3 million views and climbing toast. The silk-bloused woman nodded, whispering to her neighbor, serves her right. While the gray-suited man shook his head, his champagne long since flat. The older woman across the aisle gathered her knitting, casting one last warm glance at Ethan. You take care, dear, she said softly, her voice a lifeline in the fading chaos. Linda stood near the galley, her scarlet scarf dangling like a noose around her neck, her uniform wrinkled and stained with the day's wreckage. She'd stopped crying, but her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands clenched into fists as she braced for what came next. The weight of James's words, "This will follow you," pressed down like a stone, and the passengers' sidelong glances felt like needles pricking her skin. She tried to retreat into routine, collecting trash and straightening trays, but her movements were mechanical, her mind trapped in a loop of Ethan's bloodied face and his quiet, piercing forgiveness. I hope you don't treat anyone else like that. The plane jolted to a stop, the jetway clanking into place, and the cabin doors hissed open. Passengers filed out, their chatter a low buzz, but Linda stayed rooted, her breath shallow as James and Ethan prepared to leave. James adjusted his suit jacket, his expression calm but unreadable, and helped Ethan stand, steadying him as the boy slung his backpack over one shoulder. They moved toward the exit, a pair of silhouettes against the flood of departing travelers, and Linda knew this was her last chance, her only shot to face them before they vanished into the world beyond. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. Mr. Carteret, wait, please. They paused, turning as one, and the cabin seemed to shrink under the weight of their gaze. Ethan's eyes met hers, steady despite the pain shadowing his face, while James's held that same cold precision, a wall she couldn't breach. Linda swallowed hard, her hands twisting together. I know I can't undo what I did, she said, her words raw and halting. I was wrong, horribly wrong. I judged you, Ethan, and I hurt you, and I'll carry that forever. I'm sorry. Truly. James tilted his head slightly, his silence a test she couldn't pass. Ethan spoke first, his voice soft but clear, cutting through the murmur of the emptying cabin. Thank you for saying that, he said, his tone simple yet heavy with meaning. I meant what I said. I don't want you to lose everything. But you've got to mean it when you say you'll change. His words weren't cruel, but they carried a wisdom that stung, a mirror held up to her shame. James nodded, his hand tightening briefly on Ethan's shoulder. It's not about what you say now, he said, his voice low and final. It's about what you do with this. You've got a chance to be better, don't waste it. He turned away then, guiding Ethan toward the door, their steps measured and sure. Linda watched them go, her chest tight with a mix of relief and dread, as the older woman brushed past her with a parting shot. Listen to that, boys, more than you deserve. The terminal swallowed them, James's tall frame and Ethan's smaller one disappearing into the crowd, a father and son bound by a strength Linda couldn't fathom. She stood alone by the door, the plane emptying around her, until a sharp voice cut through her haze. Linda! Her colleague, a stern-faced woman with a clipboard, beckoned from the jetway. Management wants you now. That video's everywhere. 3 million views, and the airline's getting hammered. Linda's stomach dropped, her legs leaden as she followed, the reality of her suspension or worse looming like a shadow. Hours later, alone in the crew lounge, Linda sat with her phone, the screen dark but her mind replaying every moment. The video had exploded headlines screaming, "Flight attendant endangers billionaire's son." Comments tearing her apart. She'd lost her job or soon would. The airline couldn't weather the storm. But beyond the punishment, Ethan's voice echoed louder than the noise. "I hope you don't treat anyone else like that." She buried her face in her hands, the weight of her actions a boulder she couldn't lift. Yet beneath it, a flicker of resolve sparked. She'd fallen hard, but maybe, just maybe, she could climb out. Outside, Ethan and James walked through the terminal. The boy's steps slow but steady, his father's arm a quiet support. "You didn't have to let her off easy," James said, his tone gentle. Ethan shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She's got enough to deal with, Dad. And if she changes, that's worth more than me being mad." James chuckled, pride softening his features. "You're something else, kid." They faded into the bustle, a lesson left behind in their wake one Linda would carry, whether she wanted to or not. The plane stood empty now, a silent witness to a journey that had changed everything. For Ethan and James, it was a story of resilience. For Linda, it was a mirror she couldn't unsee, a chance to rewrite who she'd been, if she could find the courage. And there you have it, folks, the wild ride of Ethan, James, and Linda. A tale that took off at 30,000 feet and landed with a lesson heavier than a jumbo jet's luggage rack. Picture this. A kid with more guts than a superhero. A dad who could silence a room with a single look. And a flight attendant who learned the hard way that judging a book by its cover can crash land your whole career. Sound familiar? Maybe not the turbulence part unless your last flight was a roller coaster too. But we've all seen snap judgments go wrong, haven't we? In 2025, with phones filming every slip-up and TikTok turning tantrums into trends, Linda's story is a neon sign flashing. Check your baggage and your bias at the gate. Here's the kicker, delivered with a wink. Linda thought she was the captain of cool, but she ended up the poster child for how to tank your life in 3 easy steps. Step 1, judge a kid. Step 2, shove him into a storm. Step 3, realize his dad's a billionaire while the internet roasts you like a marshmallow at a campfire. Funny, right? But here's the real punchline. It's not the viral video that stinks, it's knowing you could have been kinder and didn't. Ethan didn't need to forgive her, but he did, because that's the kind of power that doesn't need a fancy suit or a fat bank account. So, next time you're tempted to side-eye someone in a plane, at the grocery store, or in the comments section, maybe ask yourself, do I want to be the Linda of this story? What about you? Ever had a moment where you judged too quick and ate your words later? Or maybe you were the Ethan, keeping your cool while the world flipped upside down? Drop it in the comments, I'm dying to hear your tales. And hey, if this story hit you in the feels or made you rethink that shady look you gave the barista this morning, smash that like button and share it with your crew. Life's too short for bad vibes and worse apologies, right? Oh, and one last thing, didn't fly away just yet. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, so you don't miss the next epic story coming your way. We've got more drama, more heart, and maybe even a few more Lindas getting their comeuppance, because who doesn't love a good redemption arc? Or a good crash landing? See you in the skies, friends. Stay kind, stay curious, and I'll catch you in the next one.